The best part about watching my supervisor panic wasn't the money, though that $285,000 offer from Pinnacle Advisory Group didn't hurt one bit. It wasn't even seeing her scramble to explain to the board why 8 major industrial clients walked out of the door in 6 weeks. The best part was knowing she'd brought it all on herself when she hit that delete button in front of 31 people in that glass-walled conference room. My name is Gerald Foley. I'm 48 years old, and 3 months ago, I watched what I thought was my career get destroyed in about 30 seconds. Turns out it was actually the beginning of the most satisfying revenge story you'll ever hear. But let me back up, because this whole thing started way before Diana Finch decided to torch my work. And trust me, you need the whole story to understand just how perfectly everything fell apart for her. 18 months ago, I took a job at Valor Industrial Solutions as a senior operations analyst. Look, I've been working in manufacturing and operations for 24 years. I started on the factory floor right out of high school at a steel plant in Ohio. I spent years in the heat, the noise, and the grease. I worked my way up through quality control, logistics, plant management, the whole 9 yards. I know how things are built, how they are moved, and how people actually work. So, when I saw this consulting job posting at Valor, I figured it would be easy money. I thought I'd help some industrial clients optimize their processes, share some hard-earned wisdom, and clock out at 5 p.m. for once in my life instead of working 12-hour shifts. What they didn't mention in the job interview was that Valor was hemorrhaging clients faster than a busted hydraulic line. The guy before me lasted exactly 6 months before walking out. No notice, no transition, no documentation, just gone. And my new supervisor, Diana Finch, made it crystal clear from day one that she blamed operations people like me for the company's problems. Diana was one of those MBA types who thought business was all about the numbers on spreadsheets. You know the kind. She had never worked a day in an actual manufacturing facility or worn steel-toed boots, but she could talk your ear off about efficiency metrics and key performance indicators. She had a corner office with motivational posters about synergy and paradigm shifts. The idea that industrial clients might want to work with someone who actually understood their day-to-day challenges was completely foreign to her theoretical approach. When I started digging into our client files, I found exactly what I expected. Page after page of generic service reports that sounded like they'd been written by robots. There was no real understanding of how these companies actually operated. No indication that anyone at Valor had ever set foot in a manufacturing plant or talked to someone who had dirt under their fingernails. These weren't just any clients either. We're talking about Dwight Vance, who ran Vance Steel Fabrication, a company that employed 200 people and had been in business for 30 years. These guys knew their businesses inside and out, and they could spot consultant garbage from a mile away. So, I started doing something that apparently was revolutionary at Valor. I began treating these clients like the experienced professionals they were. When Dwight Vance mentioned during a routine quarterly check-in that equipment downtime was killing his profit margins, I didn't just log it as a complaint and move on to the next agenda item. I asked if I could come take a look at his plant. Deanna nearly choked on her expensive coffee when I requested permission to visit the site. She told me that we don't do field visits because it's an inefficient use of billable hours. She wanted me to handle it with a phone consultation. But I pushed back. I told her that Dwight's got $2,000 worth of fabrication equipment, and if we can solve his downtime problem, he'll probably double his contract with us. 3 days later, I was walking through Dwight's facility in steel-toed boots and a hard hat, talking to his maintenance supervisor, looking at historical breakdown data, and actually understanding what was going wrong. Here is what I found. Their preventive maintenance schedule was completely backwards for the type of heavy-duty equipment they were running. These weren't light manufacturing machines running 8-hour shifts. Dwight's operation ran 16-hour days, 6 days a week. They had hydraulic press brakes that were 15 years old but built like tanks, and plasma cutting tables that ran almost continuously. The manufacturer's recommended maintenance schedule was designed for typical light use, not the kind of industrial beating Dwight's equipment took. I spent 2 weeks developing a predictive maintenance protocol based on actual usage data, not textbook recommendations. I set up temperature monitoring on critical hydraulic components, vibration analysis on the big stamp presses, and oil analysis schedules that match their production cycles rather than arbitrary calendar dates. We installed $8,000 worth of monitoring equipment and retrained their maintenance crew. The results were immediate. Equipment downtime dropped 23% in the first quarter. That's real money. We're talking about $47,000 in avoided production losses. Dwight was so impressed he signed a 3-year extension and referred 2 other fabrication companies to us. When I presented the results to Diana, you'd think she would be celebrating. Instead, she pulled out her efficiency reports and looked at me with a cold stare. She told me that I spent 34 billable hours on the project, while the standard protocol was 12 hours maximum for operational assessments. She asked me why I spent triple the allocated time. She didn't care about the $47,000 savings, the 3-year contract extension, or the 2 referrals. All she saw were efficiency metrics that didn't fit her spreadsheet formulas. I told her that Dwight is paying us $180,000 a year now instead of $60,000, which seemed like a pretty good return on investment for those extra 22 hours. Diana just made a note on her tablet and told me that billable hour optimization is our primary success metric, and she expected me to fall in line. Right then, I should have known how this was going to end. The same thing happened with Harvey Cole, who ran Cole Freight Solutions. He called me up about 3 weeks after the Dwight Vance success. He said he had heard good things and wanted to talk about his logistics challenges. Harvey's problem was different, but just as real. Fuel costs were eating into his margins, delivery times were all over the map, and his drivers were working crazy overtime hours trying to meet deadlines. The standard Valor response would have been to recommend some off-the-shelf route planning software package, charge him $25,000 for implementation, and call it a day. That is exactly what Diana suggested when I brought up Harvey's situation during our weekly team meeting. She announced that Cole Freight was a straightforward logistics optimization case, and we had 3 approved software solutions that address route efficiency. She allocated 16 hours maximum for the project, but I had already spent 1 hour on the phone with Harvey, and I knew his problem wasn't something you could solve with generic software. I asked if I could dig deeper. Diana sighed and told me that we need to maintain consistent service delivery protocols because client problems have standard solutions, and that is how we scale efficiently. Here is the thing about working in operations for 24 years. You develop a nose for when something doesn't smell right. Harvey's fuel costs were up 40% year over year, but his delivery volume had only increased 12%. Those numbers do not add up unless there is a fundamental process problem somewhere. So, I did what Diana definitely did not want me to do. I spent 1 week riding with Harvey's drivers, mapping actual traffic patterns, timing loading procedures, and understanding where the real bottlenecks were. Let me tell you, sitting in a heavy truck for 12 hours gives you a completely different perspective on logistics than staring at spreadsheets in an air-conditioned office. What I found was fascinating. The problem wasn't the routes at all. Harvey's drivers knew every shortcut, every traffic pattern, and every loading dock in the region. They were damn good at their jobs. The problem was back at Harvey's main distribution facility. Here is what was happening. Trucks would show up for their morning loads, but they would sit in the yard for 45 minutes on average, waiting for warehouse staff to locate and stage the right freight. This wasn't because the warehouse guys were lazy. They were busting their tails. But the way incoming freight was stored made it nearly impossible to access outbound shipments without moving everything else first. It was like one of those sliding puzzles where you have to move 8 pieces just to get one where it needs to go. I designed a cross-docking system that reorganized how incoming freight was staged based on outbound delivery priorities. Instead of storing everything together, we created dedicated staging areas for each delivery route. Incoming freight got sorted immediately based on where and when it was going out. It cost about $12, Q0 to implement in warehouse layout changes, new shelving systems, floor markings, and a simple tracking system. I worked with Harvey's warehouse supervisor to retrain the crew on the new procedures, which took about 1 week. The results were immediate. Average loading time dropped from 45 minutes to 12 minutes. Drivers were hitting the road earlier, making deliveries faster, and getting home at reasonable hours. Fuel costs went down $18 per month because trucks weren't sitting idle burning diesel while waiting to load. Harvey was so happy he gave me a bottle of fine bourbon and recommended us to 3 other logistics companies. More importantly, he tripled his contract with Valor from $80,000 annually to $240,000. When I presented these results to Diana, I thought maybe she would finally understand what I was trying to accomplish. Instead, she focused entirely on the fact that I had spent 52 billable hours on what she had allocated 16 hours for. She pulled up her efficiency dashboard and told me that I was consistently overspending time on projects and that while the client was satisfied, we weren't optimizing our resource allocation. I pointed out that we just turned an $80,000 client into a $240,000 client, which is a 200% revenue increase plus 3 referrals. Diana just replied that what matters is scalable processes, and if every analyst spent 52 hours on every project, we would never be profitable. That was when I realized Diana and I were living in completely different worlds. She saw client work as a production line where you standardize everything and measure success by how quickly you can process requests. I saw it as problem solving, where you figure out what is actually wrong and fix it properly, even if it takes longer than your spreadsheet says it should. The third major win came with Daniel Hobson's construction operation. Daniel had been a Valor client for 2 years, but he was getting frustrated with what he called the consultant runaround. His project timelines were consistently running over schedule, which in commercial construction means penalty clauses, lost performance bonuses, and seriously unhappy customers. Previous Valor analysts had given Daniel generic project management advice, better scheduling software, daily progress reports, and milestone tracking systems. None of it addressed his real problem, which became obvious the minute I visited one of his job sites. Daniel's crews were skilled, and his project managers knew construction inside and out. The problem was that they were constantly waiting on materials, equipment, or subcontractors, not because of poor planning, but because of resource allocation conflicts between multiple simultaneous projects. Daniel would have 3 projects running at once, like a shopping center, an office building, and an apartment complex. Each project manager would schedule concrete pours, crane time, or electrical subcontractors based on their individual project needs, but they weren't coordinating with each other. So, Project A would book the crane for Tuesday, Project B would book it for Wednesday, but then Project A would hit a weather delay and need to push their pour to Wednesday too. Now, you have 2 project managers fighting over the same crane, and one project falls behind schedule. I developed a centralized resource allocation system that treated all of Daniel's active projects as a single integrated operation. Instead of each project manager competing for resources, they had shared visibility into what equipment, materials, and subcontractors were available when. The system wasn't rocket science, just common sense applied to construction logistics. Instead of 3 separate schedules competing against each other, we created one master schedule that optimized resources across all active projects. Implementation took about 1 month, working with Daniel's project managers to integrate the new scheduling approach. The results were dramatic. Project completion times improved by an average of 18%. In commercial construction, that translates to serious money, including early completion bonuses and avoided penalty clauses. Daniel's annual contract went from $120,000 to $380,000. He referred 4 other construction companies to us, including 2 major commercial builders. But when I presented these results to Diana, you can guess what happened. She told me that I spent 87 billable hours on this project while the construction consulting protocol allocates 24 hours maximum. She called it a pattern of resource mismanagement. I told her that spending 87 hours to generate $260,000 in additional annual revenue plus 4 major referrals would be called a home run in any sane business world. But Diana was living in efficiency metric land. I pointed out that our client retention rate was up 43%. Since I started taking this detailed approach, revenue per client had doubled, and customer satisfaction scores were the highest they had been in company history. Diana just replied that we need consistent service delivery that can scale across our entire analyst team, and she claimed my methods were too time-intensive and too dependent on individual expertise. That was when I realized this wasn't really about efficiency or scalability. This was about control. Over the next several months, our fundamental disagreement kept escalating. Diana would assign me projects with strict hour limitations, and I would exceed those limitations because the actual problems were far more complex than her standard protocols assumed. She would document my inefficiency, and I would deliver exceptional results that generated significant additional revenue. It was a constant cycle. The breaking point came during our annual strategic planning meeting in late October. Our CEO, Lawrence Albright, was reviewing departmental performance when he mentioned that client retention had reached an all-time high and revenue per client had increased 67% year over year. Lawrence announced that whatever we were doing in client services, we needed to expand it across other divisions, because our hands-on approach to understanding client operations was clearly resonating with industrial companies who were tired of generic consulting advice. I watched Diana's face during Lawrence's praise. You could see her internal struggle. The success metrics were undeniable, but they validated everything she had been trying to stop me from doing. After the meeting, she cornered me near the elevator. She demanded to see all my client documentation, every analysis, every report, and every hour I had spent on projects over the past 18 months. She told me she was conducting a comprehensive audit of our service delivery methods. It was clearly intended as punishment. She wanted to drown me in hundreds of hours of bureaucratic busy work that would pull me away from actual client work. But I approached the audit project the same way. I approached everything else, methodically and thoroughly. I spent 3 weeks compiling everything: client assessments, operational analyses, implementation reports, and results documentation. The finished audit was 73 pages of proof that detailed technical analysis was directly responsible for over $420,000 in additional annual revenue and a client retention rate that had improved from 62% to 89%. Every hour I had overspent on projects had generated measurable business value that our competitors couldn't replicate with their standardized approaches. Every site visit had resulted in solutions that fundamentally improved how our clients operated their businesses. I was actually proud of that audit. It represented 18 months of genuine problem solving that had transformed relationships with some of the most demanding industrial clients in our region, which made what happened next feel like a punch in the gut. Diana scheduled an all-hands department meeting for a Tuesday morning in early December. She announced that we needed to realign our service delivery protocols and that my audit would serve as a case study for discussion. I figured she was finally ready to acknowledge that detailed analysis was driving our improved performance, maybe even expand the approach to other analysts. Instead, she had me display my audit files on the main conference room screen while all 31 members of our department watched. Then she began systematically tearing apart every detailed analysis, every extended site visit, and every customized solution as examples of resource misallocation and process inefficiency. She stood at the front of the room, pointing at the screen, and declared that this was exactly what we needed to eliminate. She scrolled through months of my careful documentation and told everyone that excessive technical analysis creates unrealistic client expectations and unsustainable service delivery models. She claimed these files represented a fundamental misunderstanding of scalable consulting practices. I felt my face getting hot as my coworkers watched her turn my greatest professional accomplishments into a cautionary tale. She was presenting $420,000 in additional revenue and a 27-point improvement in client retention as evidence of what not to do. But then she did something that crossed every line of professional decency. She opened my complete audit database on the shared network. This database contained every client analysis, every operational assessment, and every process improvement that proved detailed technical work was the foundation of our business success. Her cursor moved toward the delete option on the server interface. She announced to the room that this entire methodology was garbage, and she declared that starting today, we would return to efficient, standardized consulting protocols that can be executed consistently across our entire team. And then she clicked delete. I watched 18 months of work disappear from the screen in an instant, 73 pages of documented success, and the entire backup database of my analytical tools were gone in one vindictive click. The conference room was dead silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. You could feel the tension radiating off every person in that room. Even Diana's biggest supporters looked uncomfortable with what they had just witnessed. Diana turned away from the screen with a satisfied smile, clearly expecting me to accept the humiliation and start rebuilding my work according to her efficient protocols. But she had made one massive miscalculation. While she was destroying my digital documentation, she hadn't destroyed the actual relationships I had built with our clients. Dwight Vance still had his predictive maintenance system running. Harvey Cole's cross-docking operation was still saving him $18,000 a month. Daniel Hobson's resource allocation system was still keeping his construction projects on schedule. Those operational improvements existed in their facilities and on their bottom lines, not just in our computer files. And some of those clients had been paying closer attention to our company dynamics than Diana realized. My phone started buzzing in my pocket before Diana even finished explaining her new streamlined service protocols. The caller ID showed Pinnacle Advisory Group, a consulting firm that had been rapidly expanding in the industrial sector. I stepped out of the conference room to take the call, my hands still shaking from watching 18 months of work get erased in front of my colleagues. The voice on the other end belonged to Julian Briggs, the founder of Pinnacle. He told me that they had been tracking what was happening at Valor, and they thought it was time we talked. He explained that Pinnacle had been monitoring our client retention improvements for months, and they knew exactly who was responsible for the operational solutions keeping major industrial accounts satisfied. They had been planning to approach me, but hearing about the growing friction between my practical approach and Diana's spreadsheet dogmas convinced them the timing was perfect. Julian told me that they were prepared to offer me $285, $0 annually to join their team as the director of technical consulting. He added that the package included profit sharing and complete autonomy over technical consulting strategies because they believed detailed operational analysis was the future of industrial consulting, and they wanted me to build that future with them. $285,000 was nearly triple my salary at Valor. More importantly, it meant working for people who valued exactly what Diana considered wasteful inefficiency. But the best part of their offer wasn't the money. Julian told me that they knew I couldn't bring proprietary information from Valor, but they also knew that operational expertise comes from experience and problem-solving capability, not database files. He pointed out that if I left Valor and clients chose to work with someone who can actually solve their problems rather than someone who treats them like efficiency metrics, that was just market forces at work. I understood immediately. They weren't asking me to steal clients or violate any agreements. They were pointing out that if I left Valor and clients decided they preferred working with someone who understood their operations, that was their choice to make. I hung up the phone, took a deep breath, and walked back into the conference room. Diana was still lecturing about standardized service delivery while my coworkers stared at their notebooks. She noticed my return and paused her presentation, asking if I had questions about our new protocols. I looked around the room at people I had worked alongside for 18 months, then at the blank screen where my audit had been displayed before being destroyed, and finally at Diana's smug expression. I announced to the room that I had an announcement to make. I stated that I was resigning from Valor Industrial Solutions effective immediately, and that I would be joining Pinnacle Advisory Group as Director of Technical Consulting. The room went dead silent. Diana's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to confusion and then to panic. She stammered that I couldn't just quit in the middle of a department meeting, and that there were protocols, transition procedures, and notice requirements. I replied that my employment agreement allowed immediate resignation in cases of a hostile work environment, and I pointed out that having my work publicly destroyed while being humiliated in front of colleagues qualified. CEO, Lawrence Albright, who had been quietly observing from the back, stepped forward and suggested that we should discuss this privately before making any hasty decisions, but I told him I was done with private discussions. Diana had chosen to humiliate me publicly so she could experience the consequences the same way. I gathered my personal items from the table and told him my decision was final. As I headed for the door, Diana called after me, her voice cracking. She claimed I was making a huge mistake, that Pinnacle was a startup with no track record, and that I was throwing away job security for some fantasy about technical analysis. I paused at the door, turned back to look at her one last time, and told her that we would see which approach proved more valuable. Within 48 hours, I had cleaned out my office and started at Pinnacle Advisory Group. Their facility was filled with energy about building something innovative. More importantly, I was finally working with people who understood that operational success came from solving real problems. The validation of my decision came faster than I could have imagined. I didn't reach out to any Valor clients. I simply updated my professional profiles and continued being the same person who had spent 18 months developing genuine solutions. The first call came Thursday morning from Dwight Vance. He congratulated me and wanted to discuss Pinnacle's technical capabilities. By the end of our conversation, he had scheduled a meeting to discuss transitioning his account. The second call came Friday afternoon from Harvey Cole, who wanted to explore working with someone who actually understood logistics instead of trying to sell him generic software. By the end of my first week at Pinnacle, I had received calls from 7 former Valor clients who preferred working with someone who could solve their actual operational challenges. When Diana Finch and Lawrence Albright realized that their major clients were leaving, they panicked. Instead of fixing their flawed consulting model, they decided to strike back using the legal system. 3 weeks after my resignation, I was served with a lawsuit. Valor Industrial Solutions was suing me and Pinnacle Advisory Group in state court, seeking a temporary restraining order and millions of dollars in damages. Their complaint accused me of breach of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of trade secrets, and violation of a restrictive 2-year non-compete and non-solicitation agreement that they claimed I had signed during my onboarding. They wanted the court to shut down my work at Pinnacle and block me from interacting with any clients. I immediately met with Pinnacle's legal counsel, a sharp employment attorney named Clara Dalton. Clara reviewed the lawsuit and smiled. She told me they had made several fatal errors that would turn this legal threat into their own destruction. First, we addressed the non-compete agreement. Under the governing state law, non-compete agreements are heavily scrutinized, but we had a much stronger defense. Clara hired a forensic document examiner to inspect the original physical contract Valor had submitted to the court. The examiner discovered that the signature page for my W-4 tax withholding document and my basic onboarding checklist had been photocopied and digitally attached to a newly drafted, highly restrictive non-compete agreement that I had never actually seen or signed. This was a clear case of forgery under California Penal Code Section 470, or the equivalent state forgery statute. Clara presented the forensic report to the judge, demonstrating that Valor had fabricated the contract. Under well-established U.S. contract law, a forged contract is void ab initio, meaning it is invalid from the very beginning. The judge was furious and immediately threw out the non-compete claim, warning Valor's attorneys about the serious criminal implications of presenting forged documents to a court. We addressed the misappropriation of trade secrets claim. Valor claimed that I had stolen their proprietary technical methodologies and client databases. Clara pointed out the absolute absurdity of this claim. We had 31 witnesses who had sat in that early December department meeting. Clara took depositions from 5 of my former coworkers who had been present. Every single one of them testified under oath that Diana Finch had projected my entire audit database on the screen, declared to the room that the entire methodology was garbage, and permanently deleted it from Valor's servers. Under U.S. trade secret law, to claim trade secret protection, a company must prove that the information has independent economic value, and that they took reasonable measures under the circumstances to maintain its secrecy. By publicly declaring the methodology worthless garbage and intentionally deleting the files from their systems in front of dozens of employees, Valor had legally abandoned any claim that these were protected trade secrets. You cannot sue someone for stealing secrets that you publicly disavowed and threw in the trash. The judge dismissed the trade secrets claim with prejudice, but the final blow didn't come from our courtroom defense. It came from the Federal Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, also known as the Warren Act, under 29 U.S.C. 2101. Because Dwight Vance, Harvey Cole, Daniel Hobson, and 5 other major clients had moved their business to Pinnacle, Valor's revenue plummeted. In a desperate attempt to cut costs and keep the company afloat, Lawrence Albright and Diana Finch implemented a sudden mass layoff. They fired 40% of their workforce, terminating 120 employees overnight without any prior warning or severance. Under the Federal Warren Act, 29 U.S.C. 2101, employers with 100 or more employees are strictly required to provide at least 60 days written notice before conducting a mass layoff or plant closing. Valor completely ignored this federal mandate. When I heard about the sudden layoffs, I contacted several of my former colleagues who had been let go. I introduced them to Clara Dalton, who helped them file a class action lawsuit against Valor in federal court for violating the Warren Act. The legal requirements were clear, and Valor had no valid defense. The federal court ruled in favor of the employees, ordering Valor to pay 60 days of full back pay and benefits to all 120 laid-off workers. This multi-million-dollar judgment was the final nail in Valor's coffin. Bankrupted by the Warren Act liabilities and the loss of their primary clients, Valor's board forced Lawrence Albright out. The company was acquired in a fire sale merger by a larger conglomerate. As part of the merger, the new owners conducted a clean sweep of the management team. Diana Finch was terminated immediately, without a single dollar of severance, and her reputation in the industry was completely ruined. Today, Pinnacle Advisory Group is one of the fastest-growing industrial consulting firms in the Midwest. I was promoted to senior partner with equity participation, and our technical advisory division is thriving. We continue to deliver customized, hands-on operational solutions to companies that value real-world results. Sometimes, the best revenge is simply letting toxic managers experience the natural consequences of their own decisions while you build something far better.